Welcome to Book Talk. In an era when a Conservative Prime Minister can support gay marriage at his party conference and win a round of applause, it's hard to remember that for decades the very phrase gay rights was toxic. Not only could gay revelations destroy careers, but any hint of support for liberalising the law could put a politician to very hot water. In his new book, Tory, Pride and Prejudice, my guest today, Michael McManus, explores how the Conservative Party journeyed from the anti-gay crusading of the 50s Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe to the view that the PM takes today. And Michael, every step of the very long parliamentary road that was travelled through legalisation and various battles about the age of consent and all sorts of other issues, there's a very interesting contrast that comes out again and again between private liberalism and tolerance and the public stance that many politicians took.
Yeah, I think that the Tory party is a very adaptive party. It sometimes makes the weather, but more generally follows public opinion. And I think throughout this story, it's always just one step behind public opinion until now. I think David Cameron really is the first leader of the party, and as Prime Minister he's doing it to show leadership, to run perhaps slightly ahead of public opinion. I think that's the remarkable achievement of recent times. But if you go back to the 1950s, actually the ruling class, if I might put it that way, to which we both aspire to belong, unsuccessfully in my case, sure. The ruling class really had very little experience of having its collar felt. When they did all the research in the 1950s, almost everybody who was in prison for a homosexual offence was a member of the working class. It was working men who succumbed to their desires, the love that dared not speak its name, who was sent to prison. And then came the great scandal of 1954, the Wild Blood case, Lord Montague, Wild Blood and Pitt Rivers. And suddenly it was getting a bit close to home. I think that had a huge effect on the ruling class. Bob Boothby went to Lord Kilmuir, as he became, David Maxwell Fyfe, and said, we really need to look into this, maybe a royal commission. But it was under pressure from events. You think of Macmillan, events, dear boy, and the big event in 1954 was when these three members of the ruling class, including the youngest member of the House of Lords, were sent to prison for homosexual offences.
And one of the interesting things about this period is that although people began to think that the law should change, some people began to think that the law should change, it took an awful long while for this to gestate. There were royal commissions, there were editorials, but it was a good 10 years, really.
Yeah, I think the commission that was set up was, in the event, not a royal commission. It was a committee and therefore was able to take evidence in private so that active homosexuals could give evidence without being charged with offences. It took 3 years. John Wolfenden, who chaired it, was a classic establishment man, safe pair of hands, but turned out not to be. And bar one, the committee were unanimous, saying there should be decriminalisation in England and Wales, not in Ireland, any part of Ireland, or in Scotland. 1957 they reported, Conservative-dominated House of Commons. There was a vote in 1960, and it was kicked out more than 2-1.
And what was the politics of all this? Was it, at that stage, a party political issue with the opposition being the party of tolerance and the Conservatives being cornered into being the party of the status quo? I
mean, really, there was no party of tolerance. I mean, the nearest thing to a party of tolerance was the Liberal Party, which was virtually non-existent in those days. If memory serves, in 1960, the first vote by MPs, the vote was 212 against and 99 for. Of the 99, 22 were Tories. The most notable name was a lady who'd been elected for the first time the year before, Margaret Thatcher. A very early advocate of decriminalisation. I think as a result of her time at the bar, she'd represented a man who was a pillar of the establishment who'd lapsed and found himself reduced from being a respected member of the community to being a broken man, and she thought that was unconscionable. I think it's very much to her credit. I mean, she'd come into the House slightly later than some of her rivals, and it was a brave thing to do, and she supported abortion reform as well.
But there was not, at this stage, a great public clamour that the law had to be changed. This was almost as an expert view.
Opinion was moving significantly during the 1950s, and I think you then move into the 1960s and an explosion of liberal social attitudes. And I think Harold Wilson, despite being personally a rather conservative person, small c conservative person, recognised that the mood in the country was changing. But you needed a Labour-dominated House of Commons to get it through. And Roy Jenkins, in some ways my mentor, despite me being a Tory, Roy as Home Secretary, made the time in the parliamentary timetable for it to happen.
And there was a small group of Conservatives who supported that change. People like Humphrey Barclay, the then Conservative MP for Lancaster, who presumably came under a certain amount of fire for taking the stance they took.
Well, Humphrey Barclay came under a lot of fire and in fact lost his seat a few weeks after he pioneered homosexual law reform. He got the bill. The first time MPs voted in favour of decriminalisation was the Humphrey Barclay bill. Then there was a general election in 1966 and he lost his seat on a pretty heavy swing. I mean, not wildly out of kilter with everywhere else. He'd have lost his seat on the average swing, but clearly there was a reaction against him.
And he never got into Parliament again.
He never got into Parliament again, despite trying at least 2 other parties. He never got into Parliament again. But when the big votes came in 67, actually the driving force was Tories in the House of Lords. It was the aristos, it was the public school boys, funnily enough, who drove it. And there was a little tranche of brave Tories, again Margaret Thatcher, Nick Ridley, on the right of the party, really, the liberal right, and then a group on the left of the party, Fergus Montgomery, Sir John Hunt, still alive, probably the most resolute and courageous advocate of liberalisation there has ever been on the Tory side.
And at the same time, though, there was a political dilemma, because anybody who took up this particular standard could expect a very difficult time, couldn't they, from their constituency association, from their colleagues in the House of Commons, from an almost cross-party establishment that would rather these topics were simply left alone.
Well, you have to come into very recent times to find a majority of Tory MPs taking a liberal stance on these matters. I mean, in the last 10 years it's begun to happen. It's that recent. So from in the 60s, in the 70s, through into the 80s, predominantly the Conservative Party would take the less pro-gay position, not necessarily advocating recriminalisation, but moving with public opinion again, really, in the 1980s to Section 28.
So I wanted to bring you to that point, because Section 28, I mean, Margaret Thatcher you've just been praising, but it was her government that brought in Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which was about banning the promotion of homosexuality as they saw it by local authorities. So things like school textbooks, books in libraries and so forth came under that ban. Now, what was the effect of that?
Well, I mean, the cause is interesting too, which I touch on briefly. I mean, really the cause of it was a huge shift in public opinion because people were scared of HIV/AIDS. It wasn't well understood. In the early days, nobody even knew how it was transmitted. It was called the gay plague. At the same time, you had the Labour Party really moving to the left, particularly in town halls in London, and promulgating material which really wasn't appropriate for young children, predominantly gay. Now, the reaction to that, and the Tory party, was to say children must be protected in schools. But Section 28 didn't actually do that. Section 28, first of all, applied only to gay material, not to any other sexual or inappropriate material, but also it applied to everything local government did. So it shackled local government. At the same time, the party was introducing the community charge, the poll tax, to make local government more accountable. So the voters probably would have kicked these people out anyway. But what mattered about Section 28 was the signal it sent, and nobody will ever know what the effects of Section 28 were. The things that didn't happen, the plays that weren't put on, the books that weren't published. We simply can't know. It was never used, but it had a huge chilling effect. And it made gay people feel like second-class citizens.
And was it a conscious toot on the dog whistle? Was this an attempt to reach out to voters and use anti-gay prejudice for electoral purposes?
I fear so. I fear so. And it's sad to say that. It originally was a backbench amendment on paper. But the interesting thing in researching this book, I've discovered it wasn't a backbench amendment at all. It was all a deal done with ministers.
They just got a backbencher to front it?
Yes, they got a backbencher to front it.
And so from the battles over Section 28, which lingered on the statute book for really quite a long time, we eventually move on to the battles to reduce the age of consent set at 21 in the 1960s when homosexuality was legalised. But how would it have felt? Because one of the points you make in this book is that there are an awful lot of gay people who are the mainstays of their local Conservative parties who watched all this going on, kept working for the party, didn't perhaps see it as central to their politics. What's that all about?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The Tory party, particularly in London, simply wouldn't exist without gay men. I mean, some of the councils the party runs, but the associations as well. And I think Margot James, who, a lovely, excellent new MP for the Tory party, openly lesbian MP, said to me, the reason Section 28 didn't bother us is because we were used to being criticised and harassed and feeling second class. And I think that says it all, really, that, in fact, it was all part of the general confetti of the political climate. A secondary question is, why is the Tory party so naturally appealing to gays? And I think its message of a small state, of equality before the law, makes sense to gay people. You know, a lot of gays are entrepreneurs. So natural Tory values appeal to gays, but somehow there was this fracture that the one area where these Tory values were not applied was to the gays themselves. It's a paradox. That's really what the book is about. It's not just about gay rights, it's about the Conservative Party, how it ticks the social attitudes of the party.
Because we saw the whole thing play out again when the Blair government comes in and starts on moves to change the age of consent. And all these debates and all these paradoxes replay themselves yet again. Was this almost a conscious ploy by the Labour Party to keep the Conservatives walking into the same old elephant trap of being the nasty party?
I think the biggest change the party's made in terms of rebranding, becoming a Liberal Conservative party, is definitely in this area. I mean, it's only 10 years ago that this extraordinary rearguard action was being fought in the House of Lords, again at arm's length from the leadership of the party, a lady called Baroness Young, who was a big player in the Association of Conservative Peers and close to the leadership, just kept blocking it. And in the end, it's a classic issue of conscience, gay rights. Individual MPs should vote with their conscience. But in 2001, because the House of Lords was frustrating the House of Commons again and again and again, Section 28 had to become a partisan issue at a general election. So Labour wanted to have a Lords-proof mandate to get rid of it. I was a Conservative candidate in 2001, and in the manifesto it said we would fight to retain it. It had gone mad, the world had gone mad, but public opinion had moved so radically on these issues, and the Tories hadn't noticed. But you see, it was a core vote strategy in 2001, so probably what was left of the Tory vote was quite prejudiced on these questions, and it was appealing to them. But in terms of the centre ground, the winning ground of politics, it was bonkers, it was completely bonkers. And it was really, ironically, Michael Howard, coming in as leader in 2003, is the person who changed it all, said, look, free votes, civil partnerships, personally I'm in favour, but it's a free vote. And suddenly the Tories are voting 50-50. More shadow cabinet members, more Tory shadow cabinet members voted for civil partnerships than did Labour cabinet members. It happened so quickly.
And now you've actually got any number of out gay ministers, out gay members of Parliament, out gay peers. Are they happier people because they don't have to live anymore with a pretence?
Well, I mean, I won't name names, but some people now who are in the House of Commons in positions of influence in the party generally are old friends and were not openly gay when I first knew them and are now. Without exception, they've mellowed, they're happier, they're more relaxed, and also, I think, politically, they speak far more comfortably. Because equal rights, equal esteem, equal respect is a naturally Tory concept. It's just good manners, letting people live their lives, not heckling them, not telling them what to do in private. So the paradox is over, that sort of generosity of saying, get on with your life. The state should be small and simple and do what it has to do. Natural Tory philosophy, finally, the logic has been followed through. And the Tories get it on gay rights.
So are we now in a state of grace where it simply doesn't matter what your love life is and you can get selected as a Conservative candidate without the subject ever coming up?
In all honesty, I think now it's probably easier in the Tory party than it is in the Labour Party. And you think of what happened with David Laws, even the Lib Dems have their issues about this. David, a naturally honest man, but, he was caught up in this madness. I think it's no problem at all. It may well be because the Tory party, I think, at the grassroots is still quite dominated by women. And Nick Herbert took his male partner for selection in 2005. And his now civil partner, is just a lovely guy, a Tory, a professional man, charming, attractive. Of course, they all loved him. And they saw it as, in the old-fashioned way. They said, well, you get him free. And the fact it was a him was the least of it. It really didn't matter at all.
A fascinating tale of cultural change, political change. Michael McManus, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
And BOOKtalk will be back again soon. Do join us then.